So either the officers, if they were on trucks or they were on tanks, the officers could use their swords. Well, they were closed. They were not unsheathed swords, but even so, they would use the butt of the sword and hit the prisoners of war that were closest to them. In the case of the soldiers, they could use the rifles, the butts of the rifles, to hit the soldiers. In some cases, they used simply bamboo poles and then knock people off. I think someone described it as trying to hit as many coconuts as they could. And for Filipinos and Americans who, by that time, many of them had removed their helmets because they had gotten too hot and they were too heavy to use. Most of them were bareheaded, and that was extremely painful, especially if they got hit by the butts of the rifles or the sheath of a sword. Dropped out of line, or if you fell along the way, the Japanese would insist that you continue on. Now, many of these prisoners, remember, since they had been in the field for 3 months, insufficient food, insufficient water, very sick, many of them were in no condition to march. And so therefore a number of them would fall. Some of them would really want to get out of line to get water. And the problem was the Japanese refused to let anyone fall out of line, because that would slow the march, and the Japanese didn't want that to happen. And so anyone who fell out of line was either bayoneted or shot on the spot. Shooting, of course, used up bullets, and the Japanese didn't want to do that, so most of the time they were bayoneted. And so as the march moved forwards, as the march moved northwards, you would see the bodies of the dead lining the road, many of them with gunshot wounds or bayonet wounds, a number of them beheaded. I think they knew where they were going. I don't think any of them really knew where they were going, except that they were going out of Bataan, going north. So for many of the troops, they passed these roads when they went into Bataan. So, you know, it gave them, some of them remembered when they were in these towns, except that they were not as bad shape. They were not in as bad shape as they were during the march. So it was only later that they realized they were being brought to prison camp. For the Filipinos, I think many of the Filipinos still felt that as long as they reached San Fernando, maybe they would be put on trains and sent back to Manila, and they're freed. For the Americans, of course, they didn't know where they were going. All they knew was that they were going to be brought to prison camp, but where that was, they didn't know. When they got to San Fernando, of course, this was one of the concentration areas, so there were large areas in San Fernando town where they were put on the ground. And a large number of prisoners died there also. But after resting for a while, for some they didn't even rest, they were brought to the train station, and there they were loaded into these boxcars. So these were boxcars, steel boxcars, completely enclosed. The more fortunate prisoners were loaded onto cattle cars, which are open, wood-sided cars. But the Japanese crammed them in so tightly that nobody could sit down, and even if you passed out, if you couldn't take it anymore and you went unconscious, you could not fall down because it was so tightly packed. They were packed even more tightly than sardines in a can. It was so jam-packed that when the door was closed, you could hardly breathe. It was extremely hot, and since these are steel cars, the temperature soared, and it's hard to imagine how anyone survived that. And for the Filipinos, they felt that if the trains moved south, they were going back to Manila, those who knew the terrain. But once they started moving north, then the Filipinos knew, we're not going back to Manila, we're being brought to prison camp. So it went up to Capa station in Tarlac. And although this is only a few kilometers, the train took its time. It was very, very slow. It was extremely tormenting few kilometers. And when they finally reached Capas, the doors were opened and people allowed to get off. And it's there that they found that several people had died on the way, and it's only there that they could collapse and that they fell to the ground. I think all of the veterans remember that when they entered the camp, they were not even allowed to sit down yet. They were grouped into formation, and then you have a Japanese, the camp commandant, I think it was Captain or Major Tsuneyoshi at that time, who addressed them and told them simply that, you know, the Japanese are victorious everywhere, and that now you're prisoners of war, and they'll stay there for as long as the Japanese are victorious, and that the Japanese were bound to win the war. So this was translated, I think, by a Filipino translator who told them what it was all about. Camp O'Donnell was formerly a Philippine Army training camp. It was one of those mobilization camps, actually, which was put up just before the war. It was supposed to house one division, but I think this was the 71st Division, which is from Negros, from the Visayas Islands. One Philippine division was not as large as a Japanese or American division. I think it was only about 7,000 men, 7 to 8,000 men. So the camp was big enough to house 8,000 men comfortably. But how many people did get there from Bataan? You have about 60, you have about 60,000 marching from Bataan. And how many finally reached the camp? You have about 45,000 or so. So you have a camp built to house 7,000 men, now having to take care of 40,000 men. And that means it's the water supply, the shelters, the beddings are all insufficient for this large number of men coming in. I think there was only one spigot in the whole camp at that time, so you really had to line up to get your canteen filled. The problem was that the lines would go so long, and the Japanese would say that the water will only be available for a certain amount of time. I think they set a number of hours for it to be on, and regardless of who was next in line, when the time came to turn it off, they shut it off. And so if the rest of those in line didn't get any water, that was their own problem. So you have these lines snaking on throughout the day, and then the Japanese really very brutally turning off the spigot right in the center of the line and all of that. So it was extremely difficult for the men to get water. Now for the food, the Japanese had some rice there, I believe, but it was of course not enough to feed all the men. So I'm not sure, I don't remember the food in the American side, but for the Philippine side, to stretch rice, you make it watery. You have a watery rice gruel type of thing, and it's actually more soup than rice. There's hardly anything in it. And that was what was doled out to the Filipino prisoners of war. Occasionally you would have some vegetables or some meat, but very, very occasionally, and not everyone would get it. So for those soldiers who were sick when they came into the camp, the sickness would only get worse. I think the Filipinos were also a little more fortunate in the sense that there was a creek that ran behind the camp, still there today. And you'd walk several hundred meters with your drums, with your water containers, and they would bring that back to camp. So you have this water detail that marched to the creek every day, brought the water back. And to many of the survivors, this was the thing that really saved them. So many of them considered that that creek was God's gift to them, and it saved them. Now, in order to reinforce, or in order to increase the amount of food that they were given, the Filipino side was given the opportunity to go out of camp and look for alternative sources of food. So you have this guava detail, you have the grass detail, you have different details to look for alternative food. The guava detail would go out and pick the guava trees, fruits and whatever. They'd pick up the leaves. That's good because you can use that for medicine. There's a native medicine made out of guava leaves which can cure some tropical medicines. Then you would have the grass detail, which would try to bring in grass, and then you'd have other details to try to get food. Now, one thing that saved many Filipinos' lives was that the people of Capas did try to give all these prisoners of war whatever assistance they could. So the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor are very grateful to the people of the town of Capas. And once the people in Manila and the other surrounding provinces found out that the prisoners of war were brought to Capas, to Camp O'Donnell, then many of them congregated on the town, bringing whatever food they could. So the advantage of the prisoners of war who were able to get out of the camp was that they could smuggle in small amounts of food from the outside as they were given. But on the whole, the food supply was extremely insufficient, and it did lead to more deaths in camp.